All right, so I'm Dr. Michael Duncan Yoho, and I'm going to be going over radiobiology and the interaction of radiation and living organisms. Lecture goals. We're going to understand how radiation interacts with biological cells, understand basic aspects of acute radiation symptoms, so acute radiation, and then we're going to move on to chronic effects. Those are the lecture goals. Okay, just kind of a review from Alchin's presentation. Photoelectric effect, Compton, annihilation. These all cause ionization, and they also produce these secondary electrons and X-rays and other photons, right? So it's almost like this electromagnetic cascade. Then we have charged particles. We have alpha and beta. With alpha, when it's moving through the medium, it's primarily exciting and ionizing the atoms, and that in turn will create more electrons and photons, and those electrons and photons can then go and cause further ionization. And with beta, you get more Grams from them, breaking radiation, which is of course, right, and that will create again more electrons and photons. So whichever way it is, you're sort of creating these electromagnetic shadows. Okay, DNA. That can lead to cell death or chronic health effects. We have indirect action and direct action. So with direct action, the photon or the electron directly ionizes an atom and breaks one of the DNA strands. So you have a direct hit. Then you have indirect action, where you have an ionization event, which then creates sort of a radical, and this radical can then go and break the DNA strand. You have single DNA strands and double DNA strands, right? And single strands are much more common, but the double DNA strands are much more destructive to the DNA. So that's DNA. Also, oftentimes the radiation will also damage the RNA and the mitochondria. So you have damaged DNA, mitochondria, RNA, and this typically leads to misfolded protein, right? So the cell starts to not function. It starts to produce these misfolded proteins. And eventually, maybe a motion. Right, where the cell gets the initial dose of radiation, and then, and very rarely, the cell will survive, but it's mutated, and that's the progenitor to cancer. And rarely, and only under very high doses, maybe above 2 grays or so, you have so much radiation and so much ionization that you can actually lyse the cell by breaking the cell membrane. Usually it's a cell membrane, and other times, other higher doses, other cell organelles can actually directly die from the radiation. But this takes a very high dose. It's usually the DNA, RNA, and mitochondria damage. So, I mean, how many DNA breaks are there for one gray of radiation? So one gray causes about 1,000 single-strand breaks per cell, and about 40 double-strand breaks. And keep in mind that your DNA is about 2 meters long. So you get one gray, you have about 1,000 breaks in that DNA. Your cell is very good at repairing single-strand breaks. But again, the double-strand breaks are more difficult and require these more elaborate repair mechanisms. Question is, how much is one gray of radiation? To get a rough feel of how much one gray is. Well, the LD 5030, that's the lethal dose that will kill 50% of the population, is about 4 grays. Average yearly background is 0.0024 grays per year. 2.4 milligrams. The Chernobyl firefighters that Elchin talked about, they got about 10 grays on average. And well, you might think that, okay, 1 gray is like a huge amount of radiation, right? No one will ever do that. Actually, it's fairly common in hyperthyroidism. We treated hyperthyroidism, like we give iodine-131 1 dose, 10 millicuries of that actually gives a huge dose, 250 grays to the thyroid whenever we're treating that. Of course, we do that where basically when you're treating hyperthyroidism, you're intentionally killing the thyroid. Anyways, this patient with hyperthyroidism. Okay. The seminal work in radiation biology was Hermann Muller's 1927 work. He won the Nobel Prize for it. He took group lines and he put them in this contraption and he dosed them with X-rays. And he looked at mutations. And this is a log scale, but if you take the log out, it's linear. And he found a linear dose effect relationship, right? The more dose you give, the more mutations he observed in the group lines. And it was proportional. And this is really the first work that really established this linear dose effect relationship. This was for mutations like a change of color, wind shape, stuff like that. But as we'll see, future studies have established this linear relationship for cancer and other stochastic effects. The most common model that people use, like the ICRP when they're doing these sorts of recommendations, is a linear no threshold model, right? The more dose you get, the higher the risk, whether that be for solid tumor cancer or whether that be for leukemia. The model most commonly used is a linear no threshold model. In some academic papers, you may see some sort of a quadratic model where it starts to tail off. There is some limited in vitro cell culture work where they're showing hormesis. Some of you have heard about that, where a little bit of radiation is actually beneficial. But this has only been demonstrated in cell culture work and controversially in mice and rat work. In the major human cohort studies, like the atomic bomb survivor studies and the radiation worker cohort studies, AWORKs, this has not been shown, right? It's always been in any analysis of human patients, it's always been linear, no threshold. So where do we get our information concerning acute and chronic radiation effects? For acute effects, we're getting from Hiroshima, Nagasaki, right, the atomic bomb survivors. We're getting it from the Chernobyl first responders and orphan source survivors. Also, some of the nuclear workers at Los Alamos in the 1940s. For chronic effects, we're getting this data we talked a bit about in the last slide. The lifespan study, the LSS, this is the atomic bomb survivor study, where it followed about 120,000 survivors. And this study is still going on. There's still survivors from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they're still collecting data on them. A lot of them, of course, were children in these cities at the time, and they're still alive. We get it from INWORKS, which has followed about 300,000 radiation workers in the United States and Europe. And monitored them for increased cancer leukemia rates. There are other studies. There's the Ural Mountains cohorts. There was like I'm not going to cover it in this presentation, but there was this nuclear incident in the Ural Mountains where about 50,000 people were contaminated in the early 50s and late 40s. And there's actually excellent studies concerning this cohort, and they're still being followed today, some of these survivors. Chernobyl residents, there's cohorts for Ukraine. The radium dilators, we'll talk about them a little bit. Again, some of the early workers at Los Alamos. And animal studies, cell culture studies. Yes.
I didn't understand exactly what's the outcome to survive.
Okay, we'll get to that. But in English, an orphan is someone who has lost their parents. Yeah. So an orphan radiation source is a source that has been lost. Yeah. Okay, maybe you're familiar with all these. Yeah.
No,
Yeah. And we'll get to one of them. Okay, any more questions about this? Anything else so far? Okay, as Elgin talked about, radiation can either be external or internal. External exposure is generally gamma. Most of the historical data we have for external exposure is gamma. Even in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the dose was primarily from prompt gamma. The very small part of the dose was for neutron. And then there's internal exposure, right? And internal exposure can actually be very bad. For example, radium, things like radium and plutonium have a very high affinity to go to the bones. So if you ingest or inhale these substances, it can go to the bones. The bones are very highly susceptible to radiation, and you can get leukemia from these kids. Also, something that Elgin talked about, an iodine, highly volatile when you're working with it. And of course, that will accumulate in the thyroid. Let's say you inject thyroid, iodine 131 into you or inhale it, about 30% of it goes to your thyroid. And your thyroid only has about about 25 grams of tissue. So you're getting a huge, massive dose to your thyroid. Biological half-life of iodine is about 180 days. So it stays there basically forever. So you get a massive concentrated dose when you're working with things like iodine and radium, plutonium. So anyways, now external exposure or internal exposure. And radiation exposure can either be acute or chronic, right? Right, Hiroshima was an acute event. You just get a huge, like a 1 gray or more dose, right, in a second. Chronic, if you're that radiation worker working in a hospital, you're an X-ray tech working PET machine or whatever, you're going to get, a sustained dose really throughout your career. That's chronic. And then you have effects, right? You have acute radiation effects and chronic radiation effects. And we'll get into those later. An interesting case was the radiation dial workers, and they had a very high dose, which was sustained. So they had a very high chronic dose, and they displayed both acute and chronic radiation symptoms. These I actually didn't know much about these women until I prepared for this lecture. Evidently, in the 1920s and 30s, you really wanted to have a clock with glow-in-the-dark hands to it. Everybody wanted that. So in United States and Canada, there were about 4,000 women who did this, who painted the watch hands, and anyways, they would dab the radium dye, which glows in the dark, and they would paint the clock hand. But every couple strokes, it would dry out, and they would wet it with their tongue, like that, and then dab it back in the thing full of radium. And we just said, radium goes right to your bones, okay? It's the same column in the periodic table as calcium, right? So anyways, it's really, really bad. So out of 4,000 workers, I think about 50 of them died, and like several thousand of them displayed acute and chronic radiation effects. Acute symptoms that they had, these are symptoms that occurred suddenly in a few days or weeks. They had lesions on their skin, especially around the jaw, ulcers, jaw necrosis. They had such a high dose to their jaw, the bones in their jaw, that their bones just died. Suppression of menstruation, and they became weak and sick. As we'll see throughout this lecture, right, your bones and your bone marrow and your blood cells are highly susceptible to radiation. You take the lower dose to kill those cells. So, and your immune system is highly dependent on your bone marrow and your white blood cells. So, whether you get acute or chronic radiation dose, you can have a suppressed immune system. So what we see is people that get exposed to radiation, like they'll break out in herpes, and they'll get sick all the time from other sicknesses. It's almost like getting HIV, AIDS. Okay, they had some symptoms which are sort of acute and chronic. Radium, if there's anyone who works with radiation, environmental radiation, radium emits a lot of gamma rays all the way up to 3,000 ppb, and they're constantly working right here. Radiation hitting their eyes, and they're going blind, right? They're getting cataracts. Tooth loss, because your teeth are bones, brittle bones, fractures, cataracts, death. Oh, chronic effects. The signature of the radium girls was solid tumors in their bones. Usually, radiation hits your bone marrow, you get leukemia. Leukemia is cancer of your blood cells. It's not a solid tumor. But these girls were getting such a high dose to their bones that they were actually getting bone solid tumors, which is relatively uncommon. That's sort of the signature. Of course, a lot of them got leukemia, which is a blood cancer again. They were getting solid tumors in their head and neck. Of course, chronic other infections, chronic suppressed immune system, and death. But anyways, there's radium workers. As you see, calcium and radium are in the same column of the periodic table. Here's an advertisement for these clocks that everybody liked at the time. Nowadays, I guess we just like plug the clock in and do electricity like that. Yeah, I guess they didn't have electricity back in the 1930s. Okay, to really go into acute, we're going to do a case study, the orphan source. We talked about orphan sources. This is the Leah, Georgia orphan source incident for 2001. I kind of chose this because I thought there might be some experts in here, and maybe some of you haven't seen this one. Okay, it's happened in 2001 in Leah, Georgia. Okay, so the Soviet Union produced various types of radiation heat generators. Okay, to heat thermoelectric energy transformers, I don't really know what those are, but they created a lot of these heat generators. Okay. And they had many different kinds of them. The common one was strontium-90. And to this day, and basically they lost all of them, right, at the downfall of the Soviet Union. To this day, we have only found 6 out of 8 of these heat sources in Georgia. The other 2 are missing. Okay, each generator produces about 1,000 watts of heat. And each one has about 100,000 curies. These are like 100,000 curies is a lot. That's a lot. Half-life of 29 years. Okay, so the experts in the class might say, "Oh, it's strontium-90. It emits no gamma rays, only beta. So you just put it in shielding and you're fine, right?" But we're talking about 100,000 curies. So it's beta, so there's going to be so much bremsstrahlung, and bremsstrahlung is gamma, is photons, and photons can penetrate the tungsten shielding that it had. So even though it's 100%, basically 100% beta with no gamma rays, it's still generating a dose of about 1 gray per hour at 1 year from the bremsstrahlung. So anyways, these things are really bad. Okay, so patients 1, 2, and 3 were collecting firewood in the Georgia mountains when they found a metallic cylinder. Okay. They're working very hard collecting firewood. They decided to camp overnight because they were all getting tired and the sun was setting. They noticed the snow was melted approximately 1 meter around the cylinder and it was hot to touch. So they decided to use it to keep them warm at night. So patients 1 and 3 picked it up and moved it over by their campfire with their hands. So they did this. Here's their fire. They took about like 1 hour turn sleeping, and they warmed their backs or their legs with the source. Patient 2 slept by the cylinder the longest. They all had difficulty sleeping, and they tried to drink vodka, but they could only drink about half a cup before they started vomiting. And these were like Georgian woodcutters from like 20 years ago. They can drink a lot of vodka. Anyways, in the morning, they were too weak to load all the wood onto their truck, so they just left the remaining wood on the ground and left. Okay, so let's go through this. Okay, on day 0, approximately 3 and 3.5 hours since first contact, patients 1, 2, and 3 started vomiting several times during the night. They also complained of nausea, headaches, and dizziness. Day 1, 24 hours after exposure, patient 2 starts to have diarrhea and develops a skin, some sort of a skin rash, okay? Itching on his skin, basically covering the whole surface of his body. On day 2, they go to the village outpatient medical department, but they don't talk about the heating device. Anyways, the doctor treats them, but it's not for radiation poisoning. Then they get better, okay? So for the first 2 days, they were really sick. They're throwing up, diarrhea, nausea, weakness, but then they get better for 6 days, right? This happens all the time with acute radiation syndrome, ARS. You get better, but then after 1 week or 2 weeks, you start to get really sick. So on day 8, patient 3 develops reddening, erythema, burning sensation on his hands. He cannot close his fingers. Remember, he's the guy that picked it up along with patient 1. On day 11 through 12, more bad stuff happens to patient 3's hands. On day 13, they start to feel a burning sensation and itching on their backs. On day 15, patient 1 loses his voice. He can no longer talk. More skin problems. On day 20, they're all hospitalized. They're diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome, ARS, okay? So it took 20 days for them to figure out what's really going on. Patient 3, as we'll see, patient 3 is discharged after 52 days. He lives, but he had the heater by his body the shortest period of time, and his legs were cold, so he had it heating his legs instead of his torso area. On day 60, the IAEA gets involved, okay? And then they start giving them specialized, world-class treatment for ARS, okay? Anyways, they're continued to be treated. On day 471, patient 2 lives. He walks out of the hospital, okay? So he was in the hospital for 471 days. Unfortunately, patient 1 died at day 893. I guess I'll say one thing. We'll go into more about the specific symptoms, but one symptom is radiation damages the epithelial lining of your intestines. There's some other metabolism effects, and you cannot process morphine, which means it's difficult to treat your pain. So people that die of ARS die in agony. And this guy lasted for 892 days.
Sources are still missing. And 2 sources are still missing.
Yes, and even more. That's just Georgia. Yeah.
Not go to Georgia.
Yeah. Don't go to the forest.
I mean, it was claimed, or there are rumors that it was used as a heater during the Soviet period in the borders of Turkey and the Soviets for heating of soldiers.
That's
Right.
So there must be many cases like this.
yes, there's a
There
lot.
are- there are many.
I have a. It's very interesting. Just Google orphan sources and go to the Wikipedia page. They have a very nice list, and you can read all about them. The most famous ones come from Brazil. I forget the name. I have it written somewhere. It's very common and happens to this day, usually in Mexico, because in Mexico there's a lot of car and truck hijacking. And so you're carrying CD-137 source, and they hijack the truck. And they say, oh, there's this really shiny metal thing. It must be worth a lot of money. Let's open it up and take what's inside. And that happens this day a lot, actually, in Mexico and other South America. But anyway, you can go to Wikipedia and start reading about some of this. Yeah.
So that 2 days they are really sick, and after that the condition was better.
Yeah.
And for you, we have to do 100%.
So just from me preparing for this class, I'm not a doctor, but from what I understand, we call that the DNA, the RNA, mitochondria are damaged, okay? And they start to make the misfolded proteins. It takes time for those misfolded proteins and other damage to actually kill the cell. The cell is still functioning for a week to 2 weeks, and then it dies. Okay. Yeah, the IAEA did a wonderful recovery of the orphan source, right? They devised this container, mobile container, and they managed to do, they did an excellent job of recovering it. It's very, obviously very, very rugged terrain. I don't know how it even got here. Why would somebody put this source in the middle of this area?
They were damaged, right?
The,
The sources,
this one was not, it was intact.
because it probably just fell off.
Yeah, this one was fully intact. There was no leakage, which would be really bad. Okay, here's the doses that they got. This is IAEA model that they did. Patient 1, he got 2.8 grays, death at 893 days. Patient 2 got a little bit more of the dose, but he lived. Remember, radiation is stochastic, probabilistic. Some people are stronger than others. It also depends on exactly where the source was positioned. I mean, they are bremsstrahlons. They can't be that high energy photons. Maybe they're stopping. One guy was larger than the other guy, but maybe he stopped sooner in his back. I don't know. Patient 3 had the smaller dose. He was discharged at 52 days. And again, for comparison, the LD50, lethal death for 50% of the population is 4 grays. So here, it's all around 4 grays, 2 lived, 1 died. It seems pretty reasonable. Here's patient 1. Here is where he was injured. And again, he picked up the device with his hands. Patient 1 we call that your immune system gets suppressed, and he had a tuberculosis outbreak. And here shows his tuberculosis outbreak. His chest is very bad and actually killed part of his lung, according to the IAEA report. Well, the death of his lung was due to the tuberculosis and the source itself killing his organs. patient 2 had a herpetic outbreak. And it's a wonderful 160 page report that the IAEA wrote on this. And it goes, if there's any doctors or pre-med students, it goes all into the blood work and what's going on with his, his white blood cell counts. And you can go more into detail on that and what happens to these guys on a cellular level. So that's patient 2. This guy is very, very strong, actually. I mean, he took a 3.3 gray dose right to the chest, basically. Patient 3, he preferred to use a heater close to his legs. So he survived after 52 days. Summary of acute effects experienced by patients 1, 2, 3. Vomiting, nausea, weakness, headaches all around 3 hours after exposure, diarrhea, skin ulcers, erythema, burning, itching, dry, skin problems, skin death. They lost their voice, throat pain, and then immune suppression, secondary infections, right? Because the bone marrow is so critical to your immune system, lung tissue death, other organ death, and then patient 1 died. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the IAEA has recovered over 300 orphan sources just in Georgia. Many, including 2 strontium-90 heaters, are still unaccounted for, and this is just Georgia. Any other questions on acute effects before we move on to chronic? Here's the Wikipedia orphan source incidents since the 2020s. A famous one was in Australia, where they were carrying the cesium on a truck, and it just fell off the truck, and they didn't know where it was. It was a very long stretch of road, but anyway, it was all in like CNN at the time. But they eventually found it using mobile sodium iodide detectors, right? You can read about it. What would these? So Australia, Houston, Texas, Mexico. Okay, 2023, 4 iridium-192 were stolen with the truck. Brazil, americium in England, so very small. So again, a van containing, these are all short-lived. It's not that big of an issue, but they were stolen again in Brazil. Yeah. Anyways. Yeah, it's interesting to read about these. Okay, moving on to chronic. And where we get most of our data on cancer is the lifespan study cohort, the LSS. This is the main source of data. This is where we get that number of 4, the lethal dose for 50% of the population of 4 grays. We get that from this map here. Actually, a lot of people think that it should be higher than 4 grays because the target was this intersection and it drifted 150 meters off course. And the main, it detonated directly above the city hospital, and immediately 90% of the city's doctors and nurses were instantly killed. So you had all these people that had, acute radiation syndrome, but they could not be treated because there's no doctors or nurses in the city to treat them. So a lot of experts think, hey, we should raise that 4 gray number to more like 6 or 7 grays. Additionally, obviously, this is in second half of 1945, and they were suffering from malnutrition due to rationing. Okay. Sometimes the lifespan study has maybe 120,000 members, but some people are sort of discounted. Oh, you guys, there's a problem with them. But there's about 45,000 members that the best data comes from, and they've been followed throughout their lives. They're survivors. They're atomic bomb survivors, about 45,000 of them. And when we're talking about chronic radiation effects, we're talking about three things. Firstly, we're talking about leukemia. Remember, leukemia is cancer of your blood cells. It's not a solid tumor. It's a cancer of your bone marrow and the cells themselves. Then solid tumors, okay? Another effect. And then non-cancerous disease. And this is primarily hyperthyroidism, cataracts, and interestingly, cardiovascular disease. We see increased rates of cardiovascular disease in these survivors. So it happened in 1945. So initially, the main chronic effect is leukemia. And so leukemia dominates for about 10 years. And then solid tumors start to dominate, right? And note that people are still getting these solid tumors, and even at an accelerated rate, 50 years after the initial dose in 1945. So if you get a radiation dose, the data says that it lasts you your whole life, the risk. You have increased risk of solid tumors your whole life. And this line here is the non-cancerous diseases. So again, we're talking about leukemia. Mostly people care about leukemia and solid tumors when we're talking about chronic radiation effects. Okay. When we're talking about chronic radiation effects, we need to start talking about relative risk, called ERR. Statistics and a lot of math. Because it's all stochastic, right? Probabilistic. And we're actually talking about relatively small increases of risk. But let's look at this column first, try to understand this. So there were 45,000 people that were following in this cohort. 58 of them got leukemia, and this is above the expected rates of leukemia and solid cancers in the population. These are excess deaths, right? 58 got leukemia because of the radiation dose. About 321 of them got solid cancers, and 150 of them died from heart attacks and strokes. This is in excess of what they would have, the numbers that would have died naturally. So it's actually not that many people if you look at it. So 45,000 people, maybe less than 500 or less than 1,000 have actually died due to this chronic effects. The other numbers to look at are the percent ERRs per gray. Okay, so it's a little complicated. So this basically means per gray of radiation, what is your increased relative risk? Like leukemia is probably the easiest to look at. It's 275. That means you have about 3 times the chance of getting leukemia if you get 1 gray of radiation. 300%, 275% increased risk of getting leukemia. Only a 28% increased chance of getting solid cancer per gray. Cataracts, you have increased risk. Thyroid disease, you have about a 3-fold increase in the risk of getting hyperthyroidism. About a 14% increased chance of dying from a heart attack or a stroke. Other effects that we've seen in Hiroshima, Nagasaki survivors is altered immune systems, changes in T cell compositions, retardation of unborn babies. Okay. Note that only, as we've talked before, only about 1% of the LSS cohort have died from chronic radiation effects. It's interesting to compare these numbers to those from smoking cigarettes. The ERRs for smoking cigarettes for lung cancer is 2,000. But that means you have 20 times the chance of getting lung cancer if you smoke. And cardiovascular morbidity is 3 times that, 300%. And these numbers are actually far. What happened? I showed you something.
Questions in the first one.
Yeah,
Paylaşım durdur mu yapayım yine?
I pressed the wrong button. Okay, great. So, I mean, at least me looking at the data, it's worse to be a smoker than it is to be an atomic bomb survivor in terms of chronic risk. And it's also difficult to account for increased health risk due to factors such as elevated smoking levels. Like, let's say the cohort smokes at a higher rate than the overall population. Are increased cancer rates due to the radiation or due to unaccounted for smoke? It's necessary to have cohorts with large populations to reach statistically significant conclusions. And the LSF is also the main source of evidence for the linear no threshold model. Pretty linear at the end. Once you're getting over 2 grays, there's a bit of a quadratic fall off, but it's highly linear. This is a solid cancer risk versus dose. Okay, so Hiroshima has a very high acute dose, right? How about a low continuous chronic dose? And the data we have for that comes from INWORKS, okay? International Nuclear Workers Study. This cohort has about 250,000 members from the United States and Europe. These are radiation workers, hospital workers, they work in nuclear reactors, accelerators, stuff like that. And they've been tracked, they were tracked between 1945 to 2005. I don't know if it's still ongoing or not. And these people are, of course, receiving a low dose over time. This is really more what we, more kind of what we care about, I think. It's more interesting to us. And what did they find? Well, they found like basically very similar numbers actually to the atomic bomb survivor cohorts. It's actually very surprising. You'd think that the numbers would be different, but percent ERRs, leukemia and solid cancers. Here's the atomic bomb survivor cohort, and here's the INWORKS cohort. And these numbers are very, very similar, right? Especially for solid cancers. So what this suggests is that whether you get an acute radiation dose or a chronic one spread over 30 years, it carries the same risk for cancer. At least that's what this data suggests. Okay. So this is like a major finding, right? That took decades and decades of tracking these large cohorts. The major finding. Note one thing though, these are the uncertainty bars that these numbers, even though tens of thousands of people these uncertainties are very, very large. These are 99% confidence intervals, right? So even when you're tracking 260,000 people, so few of them are getting cancer above what people normally would get, that you still have such a high uncertainty to this number, right? Okay, these numbers are useful. Let's do a case study. It's a bit of an extreme case study, but still legally, it could possibly happen. Let's take a radiation worker at a hospital that gets a maximum of 20 millisieverts, which is basically 20 milligrays per gamma every year for 30 years. 20 millisieverts is the maximum by European and Turkish regulation, I believe. So if you do the math, in 30 years, he's going to get 0.6 grays, okay? What is the worker's increased risk of getting a solid tumor? And this is like the maximum case that is legally permissible. Still, if you're getting 20 millisieverts every year for 30 years, we should like file a complaint or something like that. But it's possible. Okay, if you calculate the increased risk, you multiply 0.6 grays by the 28% ERR per gray. That gives a 17% increased chance of getting a solid tumor. So if you get the maximum permissible dose per year as a radiation worker, for 30 years, you will have a roughly 17% increased risk of getting solid cancer. But there are caveats. There's something called the dose and dose rate effectiveness factors. Even though, like we said, that IMWorks agrees with LSS, still, ICRP looks at the data, and they're looking at the cell culture data, and they are saying that a chronic dose is about half as bad as an acute dose. The cell culture data is showing that. The human studies don't, but again, there are those high uncertainties. So although nuclear worker cohorts data suggests it's a no threshold linear model, cell culture and some animal studies suggest that chronic doses carry a lower risk than a single acute dose. So regulators typically assume a dose and dose rate effectiveness factor of between 1.5 and 2 for solid cancer risk. So we basically divide that risk in half for chronic acute doses. So our radiation worker, according to the ICRP, will have a solid cancer percent ERR of around 8. More punching numbers. Note that this is a percent increased risk, and it's relative. Okay, so we got to look. An average American man has a 40% chance of getting cancer. So if he gets 20 millisieverts for 30 years, his chances elevate to 40% times 1.08 equals 44%. So our lifetime radiation worker will have a 4% absolute increased chance of getting solid cancer in his lifetime. And you can carry it even further. About 50% of cancers are fatal. About 50% live. So our radiation worker has about a 2% absolute increased chance of getting fatal solid cancer. Again, I think that any organization in the world we sort of calculated that ourselves by estimating a few things from the raw data. The ICRP gives a nominal risk coefficient of 5% per sievert per gray for fatal cancer. That's solid and leukemia. So if you include leukemia Yeah, we just did it for solid cancer. We do solid cancer plus